Hi again, Modern World History students, and we're continuing with unit number 8, the Second World War, and also section, I believe, 8, a typo there, growing tension between Japan and the US. And what we didn't get to in our previous lesson was the actual attack on Pearl Harbor and a full explanation of why Japan attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. So we're going to return to page number 13 at the bottom there. So you will have probably already taken some notes in that section, but we're going to return to that and remind you that a sort of a dialogue had begun, in a way, between the representatives of US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and effectively the military dictator of Japan, Hideki Tojo. And these negotiations revolved around President Roosevelt's imposition of a steel and oil embargo on Japan. So President Roosevelt had responded to Japanese aggression in East Asia by issuing an embargo on the sale of steel or oil, which meant that no American could legally sell steel or oil to the Japanese government or to any Japanese company. This had been designed to try to reduce the growth of the Japanese military in a way to try to slow down its conquest of East Asia and the Pacific. In return for the end of the embargo, President Roosevelt had demanded that Japanese forces abandon Indochina and China, which of course was a non-starter for Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo was one of those Japanese militarist imperialists who believed that the destiny of Japan was to dominate East Asia and the Western Pacific, or even perhaps the entire Pacific region. That was the destiny, that was the desire, that was the goal for Japan. But Japan lacked its own natural resources. And so the natural resources of China and Indochina were essential to Japan in order to maintain its industrial economy, in order to maintain the growth of its military. And so when President Roosevelt demanded that Japan give up its conquests in China and Indochina, that was really a non-starter. On the other hand, the United States' refusal to sell steel and oil to Japan did have a potentially crippling effect because Japan had relied on the US and its trade in steel and oil prior to that time. So Tojo had sent representatives to Washington, D.C. to try to negotiate a settlement with President Roosevelt. But in reality, Tojo had already made up his mind, and the Japanese military who ruled Japan had already made up their mind to go to war with the United States. And so the reality is that whatever negotiations were happening between representatives of Japan and representatives of the US government were just a smokescreen behind which Japan was actually preparing for war. For one thing, too, the Japanese saw this as a unique opportunity in history. The Japanese really had 4 rivals for control of East Asia and the Pacific. Not only the United States, but Britain, France, and the Soviet Union as well. But think about this moment. It's late summer of 1941 or early fall of 1941. By this time, France had already been defeated and overrun by Germany. So France was now no longer a competitor for the Japanese. Britain was fighting for its life against the Germans, had been bombed. The Germans had, in the Blitz, bombed London. And so the British were fighting for their lives. The Soviet Union now was also fighting for its life as the German invasion pressed deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. German forces were 20 miles outside of Moscow. And so this presented a unique moment in Japanese history wherein 3 out of its 4 competitors for control of East Asia and the Western Pacific were essentially knocked out. Only the United States remained. And so if the Japanese could knock out the United States, that would open the door to achieving what they believed was Japan's destiny. That is, to control and dominate East Asia and the Western Pacific. The thing was that the Japanese fully understood that they could not defeat the United States in a long war. Okay? They recognized that the United States had something they didn't have, which was a massive, seemingly unending supply of natural resources that they could use to build up their armed forces to a level that the Japanese could never hope to achieve. Just to give you an idea, at the beginning of World War II, the United States had 4 aircraft carriers. which is a particular type of ship, right? The United States had 4 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. By the end of the war, which lasted about 4 years, the United States had 73 aircraft carriers. That's what the United States was capable of. That kind of rapid buildup because of our resources and our labor force and our massive industrial economy. The Japanese leadership knew that they could not compete with that. They knew that in a long war against the United States, they were certain to lose. And so what the Japanese hoped to do was win the war quickly. They believed that if the war could be won in 6 months to 1 year, then they could survive war with the United States. But if the war dragged much beyond a year, they would have no chance of winning. So they felt that in order to win the war, they needed to make a knockout punch. They had to throw a knockout punch right at the beginning. They had to essentially destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet right at the beginning of the war. And that would allow them to win the war quickly because they believed that was the only kind of war they could win. A long war they could not win. And that is why the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. So even as Japanese representatives were negotiating an end to the arms embargo, or pretending to at least, with President Roosevelt, Japanese military planners were planning the attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. They did not tell their negotiators that this was happening, and so the negotiators of the Japanese didn't learn about the attack until it had happened. But the attack was a surprise attack. Japan did not declare war on the United States prior to the attack. Again, they were still technically negotiating for peace. The attack was an attack by airplanes based off of Japanese aircraft carriers, which had moved to within range of the naval base at Pearl Harbor. And the attack began at approximately 7 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack caught the U.S. Navy completely by surprise. Although there were some indications on radar, those indications were essentially waved off as perhaps a flight of American bombers that was approaching, that was scheduled to arrive that week and was perhaps just arriving early. And so when the Japanese planes hit Pearl Harbor, none of the American defenses were readied. Japanese planes bombed the airfield on the island at the center of the harbor and used their machine guns to strafe and destroy virtually all of the American planes. Over 300 American planes were destroyed, all of them on the ground. They didn't even get into the air. Meanwhile, the Japanese dropped bombs and launched torpedoes at the American ships that were in the harbor. As you can see, the largest ships in the fleet, at least those in the harbor, the American battleships, were all lined up along what was called Battleship Row, which made them particularly easy targets for Japanese bombers and torpedo planes. Every American ship in the harbor that day suffered damage. All of the American battleships were either sunk or so badly damaged that they wouldn't be in operation for at least 6 months. And almost 3,000 Americans were killed. Half of the Americans who died at Pearl Harbor died on board one ship, the USS Arizona, which you see keeling over and sinking here. A Japanese bomber had hit the deck of the ship with a bomb, which exploded, blowing a large hole in the deck of the ship. And then a second bomb was dropped about 5 minutes later, and it went right through that hole into what was called the magazine, which was the portion of the ship where they stored shells, ammunition. And so all those shells exploded, and the Arizona blew apart from the inside out and immediately sank, killing 1,500 American sailors. In one sense, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a complete success, inasmuch as the Japanese achieved total surprise. Only a small number of Japanese airplanes, 26, were shot down, and the damage wreaked against the U.S. Pacific Fleet was devastating. In another sense, it was a failure. You remember that Americans had been sort of unsure about this war. They had opposed any efforts by President Roosevelt to move the United States into the war in a truly aggressive way. They were okay with President Roosevelt taking measures short of war to try to stop the tide of aggression in the world. But as late as the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor, public opinion showed that Americans were opposed to the United States entering World War II by a large margin. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed all that. The United States had been attacked, and basically overnight, all American opposition to joining the war disappeared. So the Japanese attack galvanized the American public around the war effort. The other major problem or failure that came out of the attack on Pearl Harbor was that although all of the battleships in the fleet were destroyed or heavily damaged, the 4 American aircraft carriers were not in the harbor that day. They were out in the Pacific doing various assignments. This represents a major failure in Japanese intelligence, and by that I mean information gathering, spying. As it turned out, in this war, aircraft carriers were going to be far more important than battleships. And the fact that the aircraft carriers were not in the harbor that day to be destroyed by the Japanese planes represents a major failure of the Japanese to gather the information they needed to make sure that their attack had the effect that it needed to have if they were going to win the war quickly. And so, although the attack was a success in the amount of damage that it caused and the total surprise with which it caught the United States, in some ways it was a big picture failure because the United States was very much now in the war. One other important bit of information to know is this, that the attack on Pearl Harbor was just one of multiple attacks made by the Japanese naval and air forces within a 36-hour period, beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor in the morning of December 7th, 1941. Over the next 36 hours, Japanese planes launched from aircraft carriers attacked every American possession, bombed every American possession, and every British possession in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific. So they bombed not only the American possession of Pearl Harbor, which would be located off the map here, they also bombed Midway Island, an American naval base, Wake Island, an American possession, the Philippines, another American possession, Hong Kong, a British possession, and Malaya, another British possession. So the attacks that happened on December 7th and 8th, 1941 were attacks on every American and British possession in the Western Pacific. And these attacks took place across an ocean separated by thousands of miles. And it really is a quite remarkable accomplishment of the Japanese Navy that they were able to carry out virtually simultaneous attacks on every possession of the Americans and British, spread out over thousands of miles of ocean, carry them out over a period of 36 hours, and maintain it as a secret until the moment that it happened. So the Japanese had opened up the war with a bang. They had, I guess they felt, achieved what they had wanted to achieve. They had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and they had hit every American and British possession. And the United States declared war on Japan the next day, December 8th, 1941. We're going to bypass this for the moment and move on to section number 9, participants and theaters of operations. So this is a moment for us to sort of take stock of who's in the war, where the fighting's going to take place. And hopefully you'll be able to explain how the Second World War was truly a global war, with fighting occurring around the world. So on page 15, we have a map, a world map, and we have some areas where you can write down some notes. So you're going to notice that in World War II, there was fighting sort of in 2 major parts of the world. There was fighting in Europe, and there was fighting in the Pacific. And so during World War II, these are referred to as theaters of operations. You have the European Theater of Operations, called the ETO. You have the Pacific Theater of Operations, called the PTO. Okay? And first, we're going to focus on the PTO. So if you look at the map, you see that I've drawn a big green rectangle around China and the Pacific Ocean. That is the PTO. That is the Pacific Theater of Operations. That is where fighting was going on during the Second World War in the Pacific. So you'll want to sketch that on your map. Sketch that big green rectangle onto your map. Now, who was fighting? Well, on the side of the Axis powers, that would be Japan, right? Japan was fighting on the side of the Axis powers, and my little pointer is circling Japan now. So on the side of the Axis powers, Japan was fighting in the Pacific theater. On the side of the Allies, it was the United States. And to make this map bigger, I kind of blew it up so you can't see the western half of the United States. But the western half of the United States on this map would extend over here. And so the west coast of the United States being over here, also called the Pacific coast of the United States. The United States did the bulk of the fighting against Japan in the Pacific theater, although the British were also involved, and at the very end, the Soviet Union became involved as well. But the United States did the bulk of the fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific theater. China, of course, was also involved in fighting Japan, not in the Pacific Ocean exactly, but on Chinese territory itself. Remember that Japan had invaded China in 1937, and they occupied China for 8 years, from 1937 until 1945. So China was fighting the Japanese during those 8 years as well. So if you wanted to identify the two Allied powers who were fighting the Japanese in this theater, it would primarily be the United States and China. So now let's move to the European theater of operations. And in the European theater of operations, you'll see that, again, I've created a red rectangle now. And that red rectangle represents the entire European theater of operations. So you'll notice that it includes not just Europe, but also North Africa and the Middle East. Now, the European theater of operations is divided up into fronts, just like it was in World War I. Technically, the Pacific theater is as well, but since the Pacific theater was dominated by the U.S., you're going to learn a lot more about that in U.S. history. So I'm not going to discuss the Pacific theater in quite the same detail as we will the European theater. You'll get that in U.S. So in the European theater, we have the fighting on the Western Front. And on the Western Front, for the Axis powers, and you can see the Western Front is then represented with this sort of yellow box inside the red one. So the Western Front is mostly in Western Germany and in the Netherlands and Belgium and Northern France. So on the Western Front, fighting for the Axis powers were the Germans. So Germany here was fighting for the Axis powers on the Western Front. Fighting for the Allied powers? Well, France at the beginning, right? But France, of course, was defeated in the first 6 weeks of the fighting. So it's really hard to say that France was a primary combatant for the Allied powers. Really, on the Western Front, the Allied powers are the British, that is the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada. So the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada fighting primarily for the Allied powers on the Western Front of the European theater. So now moving on to the Eastern Front of the European theater. So you see this gold or yellow box, which represents the Eastern Front of the European theater. You can see that most of the fighting on the Eastern Front then is in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. So the bulk of the fighting for the Axis powers on the Eastern Front is done by Germany. Germany had allies. They had Hungary, they had Romania, they had Bulgaria. But really, realistically, the major fighting on the Eastern Front of Europe is done by Germany. And the fighting on the west, the fighting for the Allied powers on the Eastern Front is done by the Soviet Union, basically fighting by themselves. Okay? So on the Eastern Front of the European theater, Germany is fighting for the Axis powers. The Soviet Union is fighting for the Allied powers. Finally, moving to what's called the Mediterranean Front, because it includes Southern Europe, the Mediterranean Sea, and North Africa. At the beginning, the fighting was done here, and oh, by the way, and you can see my little box down here showing you the Mediterranean Front. At the beginning, the fighting was done primarily by Italy for the Axis powers. But kind of like in World War I, Germany soon discovered that Italy was a fairly weak ally, and Germany had to take over Italy's war effort just about everywhere where the Italians were fighting. Even finally in the defense of Italy itself, by the way. So you can say Italy and Germany for the Axis powers, which means that once again, Germany finds itself in a world war fighting on three fronts, fighting a three-front war. On the Western Front against Britain, the United States, and Canada, on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. And now, on the Mediterranean Front, Italy and Germany would be fighting against the United States and Britain. The United States and Britain were fighting the Germans and the Italians, first in Northern Africa and then in Italy itself. So the Allied powers on the Mediterranean front were the United States and Great Britain, or UK, the United Kingdom. So there you go. You've got a little sort of summary of who's fighting, who's on what side, where's the fighting happening, and now you're a little bit better set up to understand the Second World War. So let's talk about, now that the United States is in the war, right, and now that the Allied powers have formed up to face off against the Axis powers, what was the strategy of the Allies? So we're moving on to Section 10, Allied Strategy. And I hope that at the end of this section, you'll be able to explain how the Allied powers planned to defeat the Axis powers, and how strategy actually caused conflict, disagreement among the Allied powers. So I hope that you'll learn what it means to beat Germany first. You're going to meet General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and you'll learn about the Second Front debate. So we're starting you at the top of page 16. So once the United States joined the war, they formed what were called the Allied powers. And the three major Allied powers were the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. And don't get me wrong, other countries are included in the Allied powers. We mentioned Canada, for example, and China. But the three major Allied powers who were doing the fighting against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. And very quickly, they began to discuss strategy. And very quickly, the Allied powers were able to come to some agreement on how this war should be fought. They agreed that between Germany and Japan, Germany was by far the more dangerous, especially the much more immediately dangerous adversary. So first of all, Germany had resources that Japan did not. Germany itself had a supply of natural resources that Japan did not. And the Third Reich, that is the German Empire, which Hitler had built prior to the war because the British and French appeased him as he took over other countries. And then during the war, as the Blitzkrieg rolled through Western Europe and as German forces pushed into Eastern Europe, the Third Reich was huge. The German Empire was huge, and it was very rich with resources, and it was all connected back to Germany by land. So railroads could carry the resources of the German Empire back to Germany to be converted into war materials. In the case of Japan, that wasn't true. Japan had very little in the way of industrial resources itself. The Japanese relied on resources from their empire, from China, from Indochina, and from the islands in the Pacific that they were about to capture. But none of that was connected to Japan by land. The Japanese would have to transport those resources by ship to Japan, produce them into war materials, and then move those war materials out to the areas where they were fighting, also on ships. And so that made it much more difficult. Japan's mission in fighting this war was much more difficult than Germany's mission in terms of acquiring the resources that they needed and then getting the war materials out to the battlefronts. So Germany was seen as more dangerous for that reason. Germany was also seen as more dangerous because of their technology. Japanese technology was on par with the technology of the British and Americans for the most part. Not in all ways. Japanese tanks were definitely inferior, for example, to American tanks. But German technology was ahead. I mean, the Germans had invested a lot of money in innovations in military technology. By the end of the war, the Germans would develop guided missiles, jet aircraft, and already their tanks were the best in Europe, and their anti-tank guns were the best, and their artillery was the best. And so whereas Germany, had the better technology, superior technology in many cases for that moment to the Allies, Japan did not. So again, for that reason, Germany was seen to be a more dangerous adversary. And then finally, sheer proximity. Germany had occupied France, and the coast of France was less than 100 miles from the British capital, London. The German invasion of the Soviet Union had now pressed to within 20 miles of Moscow. So Germany was like physically closer to winning the war than Japan could ever be. Japan was located an ocean and a continent away from Washington, D.C., for example. Japanese forces would have to cross the Pacific Ocean, which is vast, and then make their way across the entire American continent to capture the American capital. So just geographic proximity made Germany the more dangerous enemy as well. So the agreement amongst the Allied powers was to beat Germany first. That was the strategy, beat Germany first. It was a Germany first or a Europe first strategy. And that meant that the Allied powers would focus their resources on beating the Germans. They would not commit as many resources at the beginning of the war to beating Japan. Now, the United States was going to have to do something about the fact that Japan had crushed our fleet at Pearl Harbor, and Japan was therefore in a position to threaten to invade the U.S. West Coast. But the feeling was that the United States, once we stopped the advance of the Japanese, eastward across the Pacific, once we stopped the progression of the Japanese military, then we would basically hold the Japanese at arm's length, committing only enough resources to keep them at bay. But really the bulk of American resources, the bulk of American war production, the bulk of American soldiers would be sent to Europe to defeat the Germans. And then once the defeat of Germany was in hand, maybe not fully complete, but clearly, once it was clear that Germany was going to lose, then you could start shifting your resources out to the Pacific to focus on beating the Japanese. So the idea was to commit the bulk of the resources early on to defeating Germany, and then slowly start shifting forces out to the Pacific to beat the Japanese once it was clear Germany was going to lose. Now, again, for the United States to fully participate in this strategy, we would first have to stop the advance of the Japanese across the Pacific. But that was coming in the spring of 1942. What's interesting about the Allied powers is that although they were in some ways different from each other, they managed to get along fairly well during the war. They managed to coordinate their efforts fairly well during the war. That was not true of the Germans, Italians, and Japanese. Germany and Italy cooperated fairly well, but Japan was kind of out on its own, literally on an island. Germany and Italy on one hand, Japan on the other hand, did not coordinate their efforts well at all. They were hardly allies. They were fighting the same enemies, but they weren't doing it in a coordinated, cooperative way. Japan, for example, did not even inform Adolf Hitler of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Hitler found out about it like everybody else on the radio. The Allies, on the other hand, worked together fairly well. And what I meant to do is I meant to show you this gentleman right here. So the man pointing to the map is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I don't know why I don't have his name there. Eisenhower. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was an American general, and he was chosen by President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to be the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. In other words, British, American, and Canadian soldiers would all be under his command. The three armies, the Army of Great Britain, the Army of the United States, and the Army of Canada, would not be operating separately and independently during this war. They would all be placed jointly under the command of the Supreme Allied Headquarters. Now, Eisenhower obviously had officers, generals from the British Army and from the Canadian Army on his staff, as you can see here. The group includes all of them, but in the end, the final decisions would be made by an American general, General Eisenhower. Some British didn't like that. They didn't like having their soldiers placed under command of an American general. Some American generals didn't like it because oftentimes General Eisenhower had to make decisions when there was disagreement between the Americans and the British. He would come down on the side of the British. And some American generals complained that Eisenhower was acting too much like an ally and not like an American. But that was his job. His job was to make the right decision for all of the armies that were involved. And sometimes that meant disagreeing with American generals and going along with what the British wanted to do. So he had a very difficult job in some ways, but he performed it extremely capably. Eisenhower held together the Allied coalition, at least on the western end of it, the British, American, and Canadians. He held it together very, very skillfully throughout the war. Now, once you introduce the Soviets into this, it made things a little bit more difficult. Because on the one hand, Americans, British, and Canadians shared a common language. They shared, to some degree, a common heritage originating in Britain. The United States and Canada were both British colonies, and they shared a similar form of government. They were democracies. The Soviet Union was a little different. I mean, it was a lot different. The Soviet Union was not a democracy. It was a communist dictatorship. It didn't share that language or cultural heritage that the Americans and the British and the Canadians shared. Didn't even speak the language, of course. And Joseph Stalin was just a difficult person to deal with. He was a deliberately secretive person. He felt that by giving too much information, even to his allies, it put him at a disadvantage. And so whereas President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill got along very well, they were very good friends. And as a matter of fact, technically, they were very, very distantly related to each other. Churchill's mother was American and distantly related to the Roosevelt family. So the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom was very cordial and cooperative. The relationship between the two of them and the Soviet Union, and led by Joseph Stalin, that was a little bit more difficult. The biggest conflict between the Allies came over the issue of what was called the Second Front. You have to remember that by the time the United States joined the war, the Soviet Union had already endured 6 months of German invasion. And by that time, already some 5 million Soviet soldiers and citizens had either been killed or injured or captured and carted off to concentration camps because they were Slavic, whom Adolf Hitler considered subhuman. 5 million Soviet civilians in 6 months, soldiers and civilians in 6 months of fighting. And so Joseph Stalin was desperate for some sort of relief. He expected the Americans and the British to provide relief as soon as possible. And what Joseph Stalin wanted then was for the United States and for Britain to launch sometime in the spring or summer of 1942 an invasion of German-occupied France. Stalin wanted American and British forces to embark on boats from the island of Great Britain, cross the English Channel, and attack the Germans in northern France. Because Stalin reasoned that if the Americans and the British did that, it would force the Germans to shift some of the soldiers who they had committed to their invasion of the Soviet Union back west to defend France. So here was the thing. Although this was a sort of a reasonable request in the long run, Churchill, and honestly, Franklin D. Roosevelt and General Eisenhower were actually pretty favorable to an early joint invasion of France as well. It was really Winston Churchill who was absolutely opposed to this. Churchill said, look, we don't have the resources to successfully launch an invasion of France. We could attempt an invasion of France, but it would only result in defeat. We need to have the United States on board for a much longer time. The United States was in the process of converting its civilian industries to war industries to produce tanks and planes and trucks and artillery and all that. And the United States was also in the process of recruiting and drafting and training up an army and shipping it over to Europe. All those things take time. And what Churchill was telling Stalin is, look, the United States has just entered this war. We will not be ready to launch a major invasion of German-occupied France in 1942. It's simply not going to happen. It will be at least the spring of 1943. And by the way, it turned out being the summer of 1944 before it actually happened. But even at this time, Churchill was saying it will be at least the spring of 1943 before we can do that with success. If we attempt it, it will lead to a disaster. And Churchill argued to Stalin, he said, look, the threat of an invasion is enough to tie down lots of German soldiers. If the Germans believe that we might invade soon, then they have to keep lots of German soldiers here to defend against the potential of an invasion. As a matter of fact, he argued that the threat or potential of an invasion has the ability to tie down almost as many German troops as an actual invasion would. So Churchill argued, you're not actually receiving the full brunt of the German attack here. All of the resources of Germany are not being spent in the invasion of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, lots of German soldiers are already tied down simply because of the potential invasion of by Americans and British. He said, on the other hand, if we attempt an actual invasion and it fails, which it will, then Hitler will know that it will take at least 6 months before we can launch another invasion. And then he really will be able to throw everything he has at you, because he won't fear another invasion. If we attempt it and it fails, which it will, he will know he has a window of 6 months where he can take all of his defenders out of here and really throw them in an effort to finish off the Soviet Union. So Churchill told Stalin straight up, it is not smart. As much as you may want it right now, as much as the Soviet people may be suffering from the German invasion, as much as you may think you're the only ones fighting the Germans on the ground, which you kind of are, the answer for that, the remedy for that, is not an American-British invasion of France right now. That will only result in failure, and it will only open the door for Hitler to truly throw everything he has at you for at least 6 months. So Churchill turned that down. He told Stalin, what we can do is we can attack here in North Africa and in Italy and maybe in southern France. He referred to that. Actually, Churchill didn't refer to it using this phrase, but others referred to the Mediterranean front, North Africa, Italy, as the soft underbelly of Europe. So you think about an alligator. The two dangerous parts of an alligator are its teeth and its tail, because the tail is strong enough, it can knock you over, and then he can chomp you really easily. And Churchill would have said the teeth of the alligator and the tail are here and here. That's where it's strong. But the underbelly of the alligator, which does not have any thick armor plating on it, which is soft, that's where it's vulnerable. And he said, that's where the United States and Britain, even with limited resources, that's where we can attack right away and have some hope of success. So as a sort of a consolation prize that Churchill offered to Stalin, Churchill said, no, we will not attack here now. We can't do it. It'll end in disaster. But what we can do is we can attack the Germans and Italians in North Africa and in Italy. There, the Germans are not as present. They're relying more on Vichy French soldiers, and they're relying on Italian soldiers. And neither of them are really enthusiastic about fighting this war. The Italians really don't feel it's their war. They feel they were dragged into it by Hitler. And so with limited resources, we can still attack there and hope to have some success, and perhaps even force the Germans to commit more of their soldiers to fighting on the Mediterranean front, which will perhaps draw some soldiers off of the Eastern Front. So where will the Americans and the British first fight the Germans? Not in France, but in Northern Africa and in Italy. And Stalin sort of, very grudgingly, reluctantly agreed to this. Of course, he didn't really have any choice. But it is worth noting that Stalin never stopped believing that underlying Churchill's refusal and ultimately the American refusal to attack France at the beginning, to open up a second front in Europe, this is what's called the Second Front debate. Stalin never stopped believing that in reality, the Americans and the British wanted to sort of hang the Soviet Union out to dry and force them to fight the Germans as much as possible and to bleed out as much as possible, because Stalin was convinced that the Americans and British wanted the Soviet Union to come out of the war weak. He never stopped believing that. So there was, times were not always perfect between the Allied powers. There was disagreement, there was conflict, particularly over this question of when and where to open up a second front against the Germans. All right, so we'll get back to the fighting in our next lesson. We'll return to the Pacific Theater because the United States has to stop the advance of the Japanese before they can commit themselves really to any of this. So we'll get there in our next lesson. And until then, stay healthy and safe. Take good care of yourselves. I'll see you later, Modern World History students. Bye-bye.